yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Surya Skirhan, facilitator and coordinator for OTF Professional Development Project. I would like to welcome everyone here tonight to the launch of OTF Connect's program for the 2013-2014 school year. This is our third year running OTF Connect, and I'm absolutely delighted at the number and variety of workshops that we're offering this year to support your learning. It's my pleasure to welcome Garfield and Newman from the Critical Thinking Consortium, who will be facilitating tonight's session. Garfield has facilitated many conferences and webinars for OTF. He's been doing conferences for OTF since 2007. Am I correct, Garfield? And the evening.
Thanks, Syria. And I noticed, as Louise, as we put up a little bit of a chipmunk sound to Syria's voice as she wound her way down, which I always love with this. So I'm hoping tonight, I was on another web conference last night, and I had very erratic internet for whatever reason, so I'm hoping things go smoothly. I'll try and keep an eye on things that make sure that I'm not talking to myself, and hopefully things go smoothly through this. So many of their names I recognize, and good to have you here. It actually won't be too crucial for the critical thinking framework tonight because we're going in some other directions. There are actually two parts. You'll notice in the title, it was around creating brain-compatible learning environments through authentic learning. So there's kind of two different pieces to the evening. One is I want to just spend the first maybe 40 minutes just exploring brain-compatible classrooms, and then secondly, and I'm going to actually shift the software I'm using over to, so how might we accomplish those things through authentic, in fact, I've broadened my term to authentic learning, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, Stephen, I noticed you made a note on the cartoon by Mark Creasy that I put up here. How many of you, could I just get a check mark that Louise made? A check mark if you either teach teens, let's say 11, 12 years old and up, you teach kids who are in their teens or preteens, or perhaps you're raising a teen. So if you're raising a teen, have one in the home, have raised a teen, they've gone through adolescence, or teaching a teen. Could you put a check mark up for me? Okay, great, lots of you. Now, I'm framing this around brain-compatible classrooms in general, but I thought we would start off, because much of what we're doing in the younger grades is helping prepare kids for adolescence and beyond. So when you take a look at this cartoon, the anatomy of a teenager's brain, and it's tongue-in-cheek, could you just take a minute, and I want you to give it a score. So if you could just start, take a minute, look it over, and give it a score from 1 to 4. 4 being he's really nailed it. 1 being I think there's a lot of errors, misconceptions, misunderstandings. I don't think it's that accurate at all. And by the way, you could use 0.5. So if you want to say I think it's a 3.5, meaning it's really close, but there's a few things I would change, great. If you want to give it 2.5, it's leaning towards fairly accurate with a number of concerns, that'd be great. So if you could just take a minute and give this cartoon a score from 1 to 4. Okay, now, if you would, jump on the mic if you'd like. I'll turn mine off for just a couple of minutes. I'd like you to, what I'd like you to do, and some of you said 2, some said 3.5, 3, there are a number of 4s. So I want you to support your answer now by jumping onto the mic and just explaining, like, what about it resonates with you? So I think they really get this, keeping in mind it's tongue-in-cheek. Or if you were to change something, I think they get this part wrong. what would you change? Or is there something missing that you might say, I think there's a piece missing? Could you just offer what I really like, for example, a little tiny judgment gland just behind the eye. Does that really capture adolescence? Ability to be seen in public with parents is another tiny wee one on the right-hand side. So what do you like about it? And if you were to make any changes, what changes would you recommend? So I'm going to turn my mic off a couple of minutes. If you want to use the mic, do that, or just type in some thoughts. Changes or what you really like, what works.
Hi, I think I would change the birds and the bees part in the front, working with kids between 10 right up until 15, 16. And I think the internet phone stuff needs to be moved and made larger and more in the front. That's just my personal take, but otherwise it's pretty good.
Great, thanks. So the internet piece you would expand and reduce the birds and move that to the front. Great, thanks.
Hi there. I think a stronger emphasis on the importance of peers and social relationships, but I'd like to see it all kind of swirling together and maybe not so divided.
I found it interesting that there's nothing on there about responsibility, either accepting or shirking it.
Oh, great. Thanks very much. I was making some comments and then I just realized I didn't have my mic on. I was commenting, there was an interesting comment about the compassion and the love and the disdain for parents. And I was saying our daughter, who's 17, a few weeks ago was fairly sick with a flu bug. And I think her love for parents, and especially the way Laura took care of her during her illness, it really kind of, given the context, really raised that love for parents. And then things can shift a week later and goes the other way, and so certainly up and down. Okay, we're going to move on, but thanks for all of those comments. I always think it'd be fun to give students this cartoon, ask them to draw it from the way they see the teen brain, and then ask them to do the anatomy of an adult's brain. I think it'd be interesting if we were to say, so this is poking fun at your brain. What if you were to draw the one of the adult brain? I think it'd be an interesting task, but I also think it's interesting for them to redraw how they see their own brain. But certainly this issue of shifting and changes in adolescence. But this evening's not about the teen brain in particular, but I wanted to start us there. It is about creating a brain compatible, and so this is what I want to see. I love the adult nerd center, it'd be huge. So I wanted to note very quickly that often you'll hear people talk about brain-based learning, and I'll just tell you from experience, brain-based learning, I used that term once, and a trustee in the board I was speaking at, very politely said, I don't quite understand your term brain-based learning. I thought all learning happened in the brain. And I had to pause and say, that's actually a good point. Brain-based learning is a bit of a redundant term because we can't learn anywhere else. So I kind of like this term that is sometimes used in place of that is brain-compatible learning environment. And Leslie Hart coined this phrase, brain-compatible learning environment. Yes, and I think Kathy Dunley has talked about it as well. And so the idea, brain-compatible versus brain-antagonistic. So that's kind of the flip here. That are we creating classrooms that are consistent with what we know about how the brain naturally learns, which would be brain-compatible, or are we in fact creating classroom environments which are actually contrary to what we know about how learning happens? So in fact, the learner, I would say is swimming against the current, so to speak. If they're in classrooms, and I often say anyone who's attended OISE, and this is being recorded, so I should probably be careful, but it strikes me that we can pretty much claim to hit all the things that I would think would qualify as brain antagonistic. If any of you have ever taken a course at OISE on the second floor, for example, where there are no windows, the air quality often fluctuates, too hot, too cold, the subway rumbles underneath, and if you've attended OISE for your B.Ed, we often put you in 4-hour classes. that pretty much nails many things we shouldn't be doing. No fresh air, no windows, 4-hour classes, and then what happens in those classes. So what we want to think about are we creating the conditions in our classrooms that align to how the brain naturally learns, and that's what we mean by brain compatible. So I just want to touch on just a few things when we say, well, what do we mean by that? So first of all, by definition, learning is making connections in the brain. So learning is neurons communicating at a neurological level. We have trillions of, and the image you have here is a neuron connected to another neuron with an axon. Electrical impulses travel down the axon, trigger the release of neurotransmitters, and that's how the brain communicates across. And this is happening trillions of times. Sorry, Daphne, when you say sound, am I cutting out? Because I'm just watching my, can everyone hear me okay?
Sounds okay, Garfield. Everyone else can chime in. Yep.
Okay, good. Thanks so much. So when we talk about learning in general, it's neurons communicating, and when they communicate, we build new networks in the brain. So the learning actually, as you can see, produces physical changes in the brain. And when we talk about neuroplasticity, it's that the brain is being rewired continually by our interactions with our environment and the world around us. And so, we used to think that the brain was largely developed by 5 or 6, and then it was kind of filling in details. And now we know that throughout life, you're growing new connections, expanding the brain, and so on. So, learning then is making connections, which has important instructional. Oops, sorry about that. Let me just go back again. This has important instructional implications for. So Pat Wolf used the phrase a number of years ago, neurons that fire together, wire together. So making the point that learning is about making connections. When kids come into our classroom, if they're hearing things that they can't connect to, the brain will tend to filter things out. So we call this, by the way, the process is called long-term potentiation, essentially changing the potential of the neural networks in the brain. So when information comes in, it fires, as you can see, along that axon, triggering the release and connecting with another piece. The more times we fire that same neural network, the stronger that path becomes, and eventually the learning becomes imprinted or more permanent. So a quick example, when our daughter is learning to play a song in piano, the first time she plays a set of notes, she's firing a new set of neural pathways as she's connecting various notes and she's learning it. It's slow at the beginning. She has to repeat it. Every time she replays that same set of notes, she refires those neural pathways. And then it grows stronger over time. And eventually, that will become more permanent. She can play the song. She remembers the song. So much of the learning we do in our classrooms is building these connections over time. So as you can see here, every time we repeat, we expand the neural networks. Okay. So this is, in my view, why assessment for learning is so important. Okay. That brain compatible, if we're going to have truly brain compatible classrooms with brain compatible assessment, then formative feedback is essential, and that it's ongoing. One of the pieces of advice that I most often give my student teachers in their practicum is the need for children to have time to don't just ask them questions and then field answers from a handful, but to routinely use think, pair, share, and to use that time when they're sharing a thought with a neighbor to be wandering about and eavesdropping on their conversations. So that's my ongoing assessment that tells me if kids are getting it, if they're confused, if there are misconceptions. And that allows me to be able to step in and clarify, because note, if students repeat the error over and over, that's what gets embedded in the brain. So once when Nikita was learning a song, when Nikita was in working on a song, she had practiced it over and over wrong, and her music teacher hadn't caught it. She had to unlearn the song before she could relearn it. And Julie, thanks for that note about students being engaged in the assessment. So that that's a really important part of them understanding what does quality work look like so they can self-regulate in their learning. So I just want to point out that students need to have this ongoing feedback and they can take risks and they feel confident in taking risks. I'm just touching on a few quick things. I mean, we could on another time do a more in-depth, kind of brain research piece, especially on adolescent, but what I want to do is just establish a couple of key pieces. So first, learning is making connections. The more kids experience, the more they learn, the more they practice. And notice I keep saying they, so it's not me telling you information. It's not me doing. You have to be doing the thinking if you're going to grow the connections. So the first step is every new experience, every new connection, every new sight, sound is we start growing new connections. So if, for example, we could hook up an MRI scan to a child in the prenatal and the first 2 years of life, you would see a rapid firing of the brain as every new sight, new sound, new touch, every new experience grows new connections in the brain. And what happens over time is, in fact, the brain becomes overbuilt. There are actually too many connections. That leads me to my comment here and my question about neural pruning. And you may notice, and some of your comments earlier when I asked about a teenager, and many of you were making comments about the shift and the change as they've entered adolescence. And often when we're frustrated, we may make a comment to students that they're acting like a 2-year-old. And that's because at both phases of life, the brain has actually become overbuilt. There's been a growth spurt around 7, 8, 9 years old, and then by early adolescence it's overbuilt, and at the age of 2 it's overbuilt, and the brain's going through a neural pruning process. Now, research is suggesting, by the way, that there's a third time. So we know there's a significant neural pruning process that happens around 2, and hence the terrible 2s as the brain's reorganizing itself. We know that beginning around 10 or 11 for girls and a year or 2 later in boys, there's another significant neural pruning process as the brain, again, streamlines. I don't want to come back to that in a moment, but let me just pause and ask you. Well, Stephen, you anticipated my question, because the third time is around what we would call a midlife crisis, that the brain's going through one final reorganization. So what I want to just point out as we move along with the neural pruning piece here is the key thing is as it prunes away excess, and by the way, I should have said, this is much like many of you, if you garden at this time of year, many of us are out trimming back plants and so on. And it's not just cutting out dead. Either now or in the spring, we cut back plants and so on. And it's so that what we cut back, what's left behind, is stronger. And that's exactly what our brain does. It prunes out, and here's the key, it prunes out underutilized connections so it can strengthen what seems to matter. Now, how does the brain decide what matters? How does the brain decide what to prune and what to keep? Let me just pause and have you type in some thoughts. How does the brain decide what to prune away, what's excess, and what to keep for a more refined brain? Great. You guys are bang on. Our brains are built around a use it or lose it model. What's underutilized can afford to be pruned out. What seems to be used a lot gets strengthened and retained. Beautiful. It needs to know the usefulness and are we using it. So, give you a quick example. If any of your children play video games, I'm not a video game player. My children, certainly my sons are. If they ask me, let's sit down and play a video game, I cannot manipulate the controllers the way they do. I cannot text as fast as my daughter can. In fact, she can text on her phone without looking at her phone. Why can they do that? Well, if you spend enough time doing something, the brain reinforces that part. This must matter to our survival. Strengthen it. If I'm not strengthened, if I'm not doing a lot of the other, and by the way, let me just make a case for, as Louise said at the beginning about our work in critical thinking, here's a couple of key things. The brain will prune back what's used less and will strengthen what seems to be practiced the most. So keep that in mind if we think about our classroom. If the typical task in my classroom is a lot of rote learning, I think all of you know that with enough studying and enough practice, we can store lots of information to be recalled when we need to. However, note what we're doing is storing information is the hippocampus. It's a different part of the brain. The frontal lobes are the part of the brain that deal with decision making, goal setting, and so on. So what we have to be thinking about is, if we want to nurture thinking students, then what are the routine nature of the tasks that we're giving them? If it's a lot of recall of information, the brain's getting a message that we can afford to prune back the frontal lobes. We can because we have to strengthen the area for memorization, the area for whatever that might be. So, Sherry, your question about how do we focus student brain to critical thinking? A couple of things we want to be careful not to do. If our assessments, and by the way, for kids, what assessed matters. They will decide what matters gets assessed. And so if a lot of my assessments are recall, even if I have lots of tasks that invite thinking, they're going to see that what's actually valued is recall. Two, sometimes we give kids good, rich tasks, and maybe the first few classes we set up a nice, rich project, and then the project's due 3 weeks from now, and in the in-between, there's a lot of content delivery. The assumption being kids will take all that content we deliver and towards the end of the unit, use it to create a great end product. Well, the problem is the day-to-day learning hasn't engaged them in doing the thinking, hasn't engaged the frontal lobe. So if we want to help strengthen the capacity for thinking, which in essence means the executive part of the brain and the frontal lobes of the brain, then we need to make routine invitations for children to think, and we have to be somewhat explicit in terms of how we build those intellectual tools that will help them do the thinking. Now, that's not the focus for tonight, so I don't want to get too sidetracked into that, but the key thing I do want to stress is that the developing brain through early childhood and into adolescence is being shaped by the kinds of experiences, and therefore as educators we need to think about what kind of experiences am I creating in my class. How is the brain being shaped by the nature of the tasks that we assign? And notice I want to suggest to you that waiting till high school to say, well, now we're going to push kids thinking, if the kids have spent 8 years in elementary school being successful through rote learning, we are conditioning the brain, and the brain is going through a pruning process. Like, this is how we be successful. So I would argue inviting kids to think and to focus on thinking, as Sherry asked, needs to begin in kindergarten. It needs to begin at early age and be routine. To help kind of frame this, sometimes neuroscientists will use the term brain sculpting. And if you've read the or seen the movie by Irving Stone, I'm sorry, just type this in here, Agony and Ecstasy, which is the story of a biography, well, historical fiction, but of Michelangelo. Irving Stone at one point through the mouth of Michelangelo talks about that Michelangelo said that when he sculpted the David, that the David actually already existed within the marble, and the artist's job is to chip away the excess marble to allow the form to emerge. So the idea with Michelangelo was that the artist's job is to free the form from the stone, but it exists. And I like that analogy because in many ways, that's kind of what's happening with our brains as kids enter adolescence and work through adolescence, that we're chipping away the excess and allowing the mature adult brain to emerge. And so how we do that chipping away, how we help sculpt the brain matters. And you'll notice here, the brain sculpts itself through its experience. And so I think it's often helpful for students to think about that the brain is the only organ in the human body that's actually sculpted through experience. So we can damage our liver, our kidneys, and so on through various abuses. But the brain is actually sculpted, remolded. And so what kids are doing through childhood and through adolescence is shaping the kind of brain that they'll have when they enter adulthood. And I love this line from Jay Gies, who is a neuroscientist with the Mental Health Institute in the U.S. He said, if teens are doing music and sports and academics, that's how their brains will be hardwired. And if they're doing video games and MTV and lying on the couch, that's how they'll be hardwired. So it matters what kids are doing in adolescence. And just one more piece for us to think of as teachers. I'm seeing this today as I'm visiting my students in their practicum placements, and this very much comes to mind, that no matter how well planned, how interesting, stimulating, colorful, or relevant the lesson, if we do the interacting with the material, then it's our brains, not the students' brains, that grow new connections. And I think this is an important piece. Who's doing the thinking? If I come up with the central theme for my lesson, organize the information, draw the conclusions, put that out to students for them to record, I've done all the thinking, I've done all the processing. We need to be thinking about how will students interact with the material and how are we going to push their thinking. Now, I've said a lot. I'm going to pause for a moment in case there are questions or even just responses or thoughts about what you might do to ensure that students interact with the material and how well we do this, or what are the challenges. Perhaps from a teacher lens, sounds great, but anything like that. So let me just pause for a moment, catch my breath, let you throw up any thoughts, comments, strategies you've used to engage students in that thinking.
Garfield, I'm just going to check in with you if your mic should be on.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to come back on now. I was just giving a chance for a few of you to take a look and post some thoughts. And I'm just trying to catch up. I was just, in response, I noticed a comment, I think, from Lisa, I think, on students who are struggling. I'm sure many of you have seen Carol Dweck's work. Her book, her most famous book is called Mindset. Kids who are struggling have often developed the fixed mindset, which is a belief that they can't do things, and that becomes one of the greatest barriers. And she talks about needing to nurture growth mindset, where there's setbacks or inspirations to learn and develop that confidence. She had a wonderful article applying the concept of mindsets and a growth mindset in assessment in Education Canada, as I mentioned here, which looks at how the language we use in our feedback can actually serve to either create a fixed mindset, which undermines their learning and their confidence, or nurture a growth mindset. So it's an interesting look if you can find it. I do want to talk about gamification, which came up as well. Wow, great comments. So I'm just reading as I'm going through here. Sherry, it's interesting to know that our content focus and all those specific expectations. I've been doing, starting to end up doing a lot of work again in Alberta. We did it a number of years ago, but Alberta is going through 4 trips there in October. They're going through what they call a curriculum redesign process, and Alberta, which has top scorers in Canada and internationally, are looking at redesigning their curriculum so that the curriculum writers who have been starting to work on this have been told 10 expectations per course per grade level. So take any one of your courses, you get only 10 expectations. And what it's really forcing them to do is to think about what are the big concepts, the core ideas, and then it's giving teachers the freedom to say, so what examples will we use to illustrate the concept? What examples, so in a history course, the details I use could be different than someone else, but we're both getting at a similar concept or idea, but we don't have to teach the exact same content. It's a very interesting process, at least on paper. It's going to create all kinds of interesting challenges in how you publish for something like that, where everyone's creating their own specific details, and teachers who've always liked an inquiry approach are enjoying it. Beginning teachers, not as comfortable in the subject area, are stressed by it. So it has some interesting implications. Very quick comments on couple of things on collaboration. I think, first of all, let's make sure we don't confuse collaboration with cooperation. That cooperative learning, which is excellent for students, but cooperative learning is in fact a teacher-controlled structure where we tend to set the groups, give the focus, set the time limits, and tell them what's produced. Collaborative thinking differs in that it's entered into more freely, and that we could have some collaborative conversation this evening in which we could disagree with each other, but the points you raise push my thinking, and as a result, I still disagree with you, but boy, you've really got me to think more deeply. So collaboration does not necessarily require that students arrive at the common end product or agreement, but that we set the structures for them to explore in helpful and safe environments for them to push their ideas. Depending on the culture in the school, part of my answer would be how do we get them there? We start small. One of the mistakes that I often see is that we jump in as too complex of a strategy for students who have trouble. If a child can't turn to one other student and have a thoughtful conversation with one person, then we shouldn't be putting them into groups of 4 to do that. And sometimes we jump in with strategies that are too complex where kids haven't yet developed the capacity to think together with one other person. So I would argue that in some ways, figuring out the right, what are my kids ready to do, make sure they can do that well. So use a think pair, and then, after maybe a couple of weeks and I see that, okay, they're getting this, then I might have that pair turn to another pair and share their thinking. But if I go too quickly to a group of 4, it'll just fall apart on me. So anyway, those are some quick pieces. Great, good suggestions. And Julie, you're absolutely right. We should be assessing overall, not specific. That unfortunately doesn't stop people from thinking that they, because we are also supposed to address in instruction the specific, and textbooks insist, I can tell you, publishers insist that if it's an EG, it gets into the textbook. And so in my view, we have overbuilt textbooks with way too much content, and if the text becomes the curriculum, then we actually get bogged down in a lot of the details. So I think these are good issues you're raising. I like the collaboration with Google Docs, and I think a lot of online tools, and we're going to talk about that. All right, so just shifting, now there was, gamification I just wanted to touch on briefly. And when I've been thinking lately about gamification and learning, I'm not talking about necessarily, finding video games that I could use in my class. Although the research, and this evening, when I was getting ready for this evening, I was reviewing some notes that I had made a few years ago, and even Jay Geed's comment that I showed you. Let me just back up, because there is a bias in it. He says here, you'll notice if they're doing music, sports, and academics, that's the positive stuff by implication in the statements. That's how they'll be hard to write. If they're doing video games and MTV and lying on the couch, those are meant to be the bad things. But in fact, as some of you have mentioned, there are a lot of video games that actually are quite good at nurturing frontal lobe development. The games that require students to gather information, make decisions in light of the information, can get a bad rap when in fact they actually can be very good at nurturing brain growth. But let me give you from a slightly different lens the gamification piece. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen me talk around a cascading approach. Again, not tonight's topic. But I think it's important to note, in schools, we have a tendency to feel we need to teach content before we can give kids the task. So what often happens is the sense that we're going to give you a project, but first I have to impart information to you so you can use that information to do your project. And I want you to think about that. That is a very contradictory to the world that kids live in. And this is what I want you to think about. Any of you, and if I remember correctly, about 2/3 of you put up a green check when I asked if you're raising a teen or teaching a teen. So think about this. Those teens that you teach or are raising, many of them involved in video games. How many of them read check mark or X? Check if you think, do kids just start playing the game, check, or X, Do kids read the manual first and then play the game? Could you throw up a check mark or an X? Check means they just start playing. X means they read the manual before they start playing. See, look at the consistency, and I would believe that you're absolutely right. Let me ask you another question. I love that, Steve. Let me ask you another question, more personal to you. Has anyone here this evening, in the last year, downloaded an app to your smartphone and then tried to find a manual to read first? My guess is that every one of you are going, first of all, I didn't think there were manuals. See, what I'm trying to get at is we live in a world in which apps you download and you start, exactly, there are no manuals. You simply download the app and you learn to use it by exploring it. You use it. The world kids are growing up in outside of school is an immersive one, right? You get playing the game. When it didn't work, you hit the reset button, you try it again. Absolutely. Facebook has, how many of you play 4 pictures in a word? Anyone play 4 pictures in a word? My guess is if you play 4 pictures in a word, you probably get stuck at some point and you're looking for help from others. There's your collaborative thinking. Okay, I'm stumped. Can you help me with this? And by the way, I want you to know what happens when you get stumped. If you leave it for a couple of days, they'll send you an email with a little clue to help get you back into it. Kids are growing up in a world where they immerse themselves in the experience and then they try to figure it out, and if they need clues, they'll look for it then. What I'm saying to you is I think often kids step into our classrooms and they have a very different experience. Sit tight while I impart content to you, and at the end of the content, we'll have a debate, we'll do an interesting project. The world they live in outside of school is immerse yourself in and learn through the task, and in schools, it's complete the task at the end. So in a child's brain growing up in a digital world, which is a much more immersive experience, much of what we do in schools is in fact contrary to how they naturally are learning themselves. I love that comment, Judy. So, this is one of the things I want us to think about. Now, I wanted to start shifting, and then I want to get to the authentic learning. A couple of quick thoughts around supporting the developing brain. We know from the research that the most powerful learning happens when you move from the concrete to the abstract. I have said this to many teachers over the years, move from the concrete to the abstract, and I can tell you in almost every session I have teachers nodding in agreement, and then I'll ask them, so for example, if you take your kids in grade 4 to medieval times, where in the learning does that field trip happen? Or if you go to Queen's Park, or you go, and I can tell you about 80% of teachers I ask take kids on the field trip at the end rather than at the beginning. So it becomes like a reward, or I suppose we think it'll consolidate their learning. But imagine, well, medieval's now gone out of the grade 4, but imagine had I taken kids at the beginning of a medieval unit and they experienced, and we came back and questioned, were the costumes accurate? Did they get the food right? You know, what could we think about and go deeper with? Could I take kids on a field trip for geography or environmental science and experience it first and then come back with lots of questions to explore? So notice that feeds into my second one. If we use the concrete, the experience first, then we can design inquiry units where the inquiries are flowing from the kids. So we choreograph, or we kind of choreograph the learning to get kids thinking about real, about the world around them. I talk here about, I just mentioned genuine collaboration, asking kids to work together to find 10 dates in your book and put them on a timeline. Kids are, why would I do that? I can do that on my own. So our brains are social organs. We do want to interact, but create situations where that interaction actually will benefit the learner, that they'll see purpose. And throughout, I've seen some of you talk about assessment, where kids set their goals and they think about and they monitor for self-regulation. So a couple of just quick things here. Helping them solve problems. Try to connect. We're going to get to the authentic piece in a moment. Provide them with decision-making models or ways in which, how will you make that decision? What thinking strategy might we use? And I often want us to think about purpose and audience. who might we create this for, and how do we give it kind of an authentic context? And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Another key piece is letting students fail forward. Notice when I was encouraging you earlier to allow kids to try something out, then they can fail at it and say, that's okay. What I love in video games is the fact they have the reset button. I tried something, I took a risk, it didn't work, I just hit the reset button, and we get to try it again. My question often is, where's the reset button in education? And so one of the things I want us to think about, what's the reset button in my class? So when kids try something out, and it doesn't work, that's okay. They learn why it didn't work, they figure it out, and they move forward. And then how do we put the pieces in place? Note a couple of things here. Multitasking is a myth. Kids really don't multitask well. They actually task switch. So sometimes we actually ask kids to multitask, and they're going to struggle with that. Graphic organizers help them make sense, help them see connections, help them build those links. These are just a couple of examples. I should add to that Euler diagrams, Venn diagrams, concept mapping, and so on. The other thing to keep in mind, movement and cognition are connected. So the cerebellum at the base of the brain, we now know that it not only coordinates movement, but we also know that it actually triggers thinking. I think from a brain-compatible perspective, kids sit still for way too long in classes. We need to get them up moving around. We need to facilitate that movement so that it contributes to more conversation. And one last piece I just want to touch on briefly, the role of emotion in learning. Let me just jump by at this piece. I wanted to show you because I want to watch our time here. Especially adolescents, those of you who work with either teaching or raising an adolescent, teens don't read facial expressions well. The last part of the brain to fully develop are the frontal lobes, which is the part where decision making and goal setting takes place. Information travels more slowly in teens. This image that you see here was shown to a group of adults and a group of teens. And they were all hooked up to MRI scans when they're shown the image. When the teens saw this image, they were very inconsistent. If you looked at the responses, when asked to identify the emotion in this picture, there was a wide range and a very inconsistent range from teens. The adults were very consistent. Almost 100% recognized fear or a related emotion to fear. The images you see on the top is a typical teen brain lit up in the amygdala, or the emotional part of the brain. The adult brain lit up in the frontal lobes. The teen brain, the information first goes to the amygdala, and it travels more slowly to the frontal lobe. So we get a gut reaction. Often with teens, we will have situations where they may say something that wasn't too bad, but when questioned about it, they overreact, or they laugh at inappropriate times, or they make inappropriate comments. They may not have actually meant to be rude, for example, but they saw humor in it. Or they overreact because they think they're getting in trouble when in fact we were showing concern. So it's one of the things I think we need to think about. And we're going to shift in just 1 minute. I want to shift over to authentic learning, and it's really because of this piece with Pat Wolf, that emotion drives attention, attention drives learning. Our brains, you can see, as she said, are biologically programmed for information that has emotional content. The things that matter to us as learners, we tend to pay more attention to. So we're going to shift to authentic learning away from the brain piece. Any quick questions or comments just before we shift? Because I want to make a shift over there for the last 40 minutes that we have. Okay, I think we're good. Now, I just have to shift because I'm using a different software, so bear with me while I shift over. So I'm hoping what you see, this one I can't upload, so I kind of have to slide it over and move them back and forth. And just so, Louise, maybe you can just give me a note that you can see this okay. It should say bringing the outside in. Can you just give me a yes, you can see it, a happy face, something that lets me know that this is working. Okay, great. So let me just very, very quickly make a note for you. For a number of years, I'd worked in areas around authentic assessment and lots of research around authentic assessment. But in the last little while, I've been thinking that I think we need to actually go beyond authentic assessment. So authentic assessments we'll talk about in a moment, but I think we actually want to start talking more about authentic learning. I think to broaden it. And we raised earlier, and I'm going to show this study to you fairly quickly, because a lot of the conversations often around we want to engage students. Students are more engaged. So let's just pause. What does that actually mean to engage students? I'll just quickly show you. This is a study done by David Chernoff. So let's type that name in the box here. David Chernoff was a study of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, did this study on engagement. And he did it by, he did it by giving a group of high school students a wristband device that would randomly, let me just move that over. How's that? Can we see? Let's see. Okay, there we go. So he gave these students a wristband, and any time of night or day, they'd get a little buzz on the wrist. And they had to pause at whatever they were doing and record their level of engagement in a journal they kept. The students had been given a definition for engagement. So I'm just going to quickly show you what they found, and we'll just see if you can think about, so what does this suggest to us about what it means to be engaged? First, the students said they were more engaged in arts and tech than they were in academic. And secondly, they said they were more engaged in science than they were in math. What I'd like you to do is just in the chat window, and I'll just try to monitor it very briefly. If you're surprised, let me know why that surprises you. If you're not surprised, could you just type in, what does this suggest to us about what it means to be engaged? Why would kids be more engaged in arts and tech than academic, and why are they more engaged in science than math? Okay, great. Now, let me show you the next piece. The students reported they were more engaged in math than they were in history or social science. Can you explain that to me? Why, despite lots of conversation in education circles around math phobia and needing to increase students' math scores, how come the kids say they're more engaged in math than they're in history? And Louise, what does that mean? We need to change the way we teach history. What's wrong with the way we teach it? And be kind, because I used to teach history. Okay, great. Last piece I'm going to show you. Students reported they are more engaged, writing a test than watching a movie in your class. How come? And by the way, it doesn't mean it was a boring movie, doesn't mean it was a documentary. The kids, when asked, remember they have a definition for engagement. Why are they more engaged writing a test than watching a movie? And Louise, much like your last comment there about not about memorizing, what does this tell you that engagement is not necessarily? Okay. So I'm seeing people say that they're thinking about their marks. There's a purpose. Movies are passive. The test isn't. Okay, they're involved in the task. Okay. I'm sure if I were to ask you, if you're writing an exam in university and you're participating in the study, you would probably not want to get that little buzz on the wrist partway through your exam. And the key, and I think many of you are kind of hinting at this, because it'll break our concentration. In the test, I'm involved. The 3 criteria that are used to define engagement by Chernoff and that are generally accepted, is it active versus passive learning? Is it relevant to the learner? And note the key there is to the learner, and high degree of concentration. Those are that to engage is not necessarily to entertain me. Okay, it is in fact to get students. It comes from the French word to commit to get me committed to doing something that requires that I concentrate, that I pay attention, and so on. Some of you will have seen this. I'll just put up briefly that we've been working on an engagement taxonomy in which we want to think about engagement more deeply. So rather than just measuring time on task, which would be our bottom level, we want to be thinking about if students actually are interested in what they're learning, they're more likely to do the task. If they see value, they're more likely to find it interesting and do the task. Sorry, I'll just move that over a bit. But I want you to note, up to that 3rd level, I could convince you that the math lesson I'm about to teach will one day be helpful to you in your career and your life. I could teach the lesson in a really interesting way so that you want to complete my task, but I could still do it in a very rote way. I could teach a history lesson in which you copy all the notes down. You found my lesson very entertaining, quite engaging to listen to. You know, I really enjoyed listening to that lesson. I wrote it all down, but I never pushed your thinking. So what we want to be thinking about is, how do I challenge kids? How do I push their thinking so that in a way that connects to something they value and the way that they'll find interesting. Now I'm putting those together because in our top level is to transform. Like, did I have a transformative impact? I want you to know that I could frame my whole course around critical thinking questions and yet never have kids find them interesting or relevant to them. So the important point in that is that we need to pay attention to all these levels. It's not merely creating a thinking task. It is thinking about what will interest kids. What will they see as valuable? How will I grab their attention so I can get them to do the thinking? So we've been playing with this taxonomy as a way to try to think about engagement. How do we continue to deepen engagement, not just get kids to pay attention, but in a passive way. Now, I want to shift us a little bit. Oh, great. So the Peter Seixas book, Julie, I see you mentioning, on the Big Six, getting them engaged in the history. So here's what I want to do is I want to shift a little bit to, as I said earlier, authentic learning. So it's a term I'm just starting to use more recently to move us beyond authentic assessment. In other words, the end product. See, authentic assessments, you come into schools in a very traditional schooling way to do the learning, and then in the end we give you a task which has a more authentic context. It strikes me that we could enrich that conversation by broadening it to authentic learning, where students are invited to solve real problems that connect to the world through our disciplines, that the evidence that they work with get beyond the classroom, beyond the made-for-education video, the textbook that was crafted for your classroom, and kids begin using authentic sources of information, which could be others, could be documents, all kinds of pieces. And that where possible, we invite students to share their learning in ways other than pen and paper and in ways beyond the classroom. So what I want to think about is, can we start thinking about authentic learning so that we pose rich, engaging tasks that connect to the world, that kids gather information from the world around them, and that they share that information out. I'll give you a quick example, because when I went over the list, I know some of you are working with very young children, some of you with older children. So I don't know if any of you are fans of Phineas and Ferb, but my daughter and I are quite big fans of Phineas and Ferb. I find this very entertaining, and sometimes I think it's a very intelligently written cartoon. Anyway, one of their episodes, if you're not familiar, Phineas is the boy on the left and Ferb's on the right. And Phineas and Ferb, the show is set around their summer holidays where they're bored each day and they come up with something cool to do, and then they invent things. So one episode was called Swinter, and they took an ice machine, kind of charged it, and so they created snow in their backyard and had winter. I want you to note, if I were to ask students how many summer and winter activities can you find in the clip that I show kids, what other ones could you add, and which 5 would you want to take part in? So I want to be very clear on this. That is not a critical thinking exercise. Okay, so what I want you to see is what I set out here is not a critical thinking exercise. Kids would simply look, they'd watch, they'd say, oh, I saw skiing, I saw them making snowmen, I saw this. They write me a list. What could you add? Oh, I could add this, this, and this. They add to the list. I never ask them to make a decision or a judgment. If you could take part, which ones would you want to take part in? That's what we call a preference question. Oh, I like to do this. That's why I would do it. Let me show you my tweak. Swinter has become a national hit. Various cities are vying for the opportunity. I need to change my date to host Winterfest, 2013. Which, if you take the grade 4 curriculum, for example, where students are looking at different regions of Canada, I could use Winterfest. So what I'm showing here is I might grab a Phineas and Ferb clip as my launch and ask kids, if we had Winterfest in Canada, which would be the best place? Or it could be in North America. Here I've got a mix. Should we hold it in Vancouver, Montreal, Juneau, Alaska, or just pick Canadian sites if you want? I give kids 3 criteria. You have to be able to hold both summer and winter-like activities. It has to be fairly accessible for travelers and have a rich cultural nightlife. So kids now have to fan out and do some research on their assigned area or city and come back and try to make a pitch on why it would be best for Winterfest. Wanted to show you that as a way that I might engage younger kids in giving a purpose for the reading and onto the internet and other ways we'll explore they go. Jumping to the other end of the scale. Anyone teach business or economics by any chance? I'm just going to slide this over. Anyone doing any business or economics? Just put a check up if you are. Anyone? Well, this is probably a poor choice, but maybe it'll fascinate you. I don't know if how many of you, check mark if you've heard of Bitcoins. Has anyone heard of Bitcoins? One person, okay. Well, Bitcoins are an interesting development in currency. They're a virtual currency. I want to show you a task that I might get, if I wanted students in a business or an economics course to develop an understanding of the concept of currency. This is how I would use the whole issue right now about Bitcoins in a kind of as an authentic question. Should we embrace it as currency? I just read this past week that I think in Vancouver the first ATM for Bitcoins has been installed. So I would do this by getting students to think about, well, if we're going to decide if Bitcoins make a good currency, we have to understand the attributes of good currency. So I'm going to show you non-examples. Why would caviar, and someone just type me a reason, why would caviar be not a good example of, why would it make poor currency? Great. Judy, so I suppose you're saying you really don't want to carry around a bunch of caviar in your purse, and Sherry should point out it's going to rot over time, right? So caviar, probably not a great because it decomposes, it's going to be smelly. Okay, so what we do, by the way, is, as kids say this, is we point out one of the criteria often used to determine good currency. Well, the cats will follow. So it's not durable. A good currency needs to be durable. How about this cute little pig? He's more durable. Might get smelly. He hopefully won't decompose right away. Why would this pig not make good currency? You have to feed it, right? It's very daft. I'm showing you. So can't fit in your wallet. Can make my wallet from them, perhaps. Okay. So portability is difficult. I'd have to carry the food around with it. Has to be walked, and so on. So we get kids thinking about, so what's wrong with these types? How about these purses? They're durable. They're portable. Why would they not make good currency? Okay, too complicated. And let me just, whoops. Just do that for you. I'm just making it a little larger for you to see. Let me ask you this. Do any of you like one more than another? Or are there any of them that you know, personally I think the one on the left, the third one down on the left is one that I like the best. See, what I want to show you here is there's no uniformity. And the problem with a lack of uniformity, we're going to debate about, yeah, but if you're trading me for this, I want this one, not that one. So currency has to have a certain uniformity. How about sand? Sand is durable, it's portable, it's certainly uniform. Why not use sand for currency? Okay, messy in your pocket. Spills. What if I'm running low on sand today and I want to go buy a new car? What do I do? Okay, pour during the winter. And note, because there's so much of it, how does it have value? Because I can just go get it whenever I need it. I'm sorry, I forgot to click on that one. Just give me a second. I forgot to bring up my. There we go. So there has to be a limited supply to give currency value. Otherwise, there's no value. And lastly, land. How about we use land? What would be wrong with land? And we get kids to see that it's hard to divide. If I need a bag of milk, how much land am I going to give you? And then the tester we give kids, would diamonds make good currency? Take a look at our criteria, decide whether they would or would not. So what I want you to note, I'm just trying to build kids' understanding of the concept of currency in the economics class, but I'm using an example that's in the news. We then teach them a bit about bitcoins. Notice this is a bitcoin, and remember it's virtual currency, so they actually don't really exist. But bitcoins on them say justice, truth, liberty, freedom, and in cryptography we trust. So here's and I won't bore you with the details, but bitcoins are virtual currency that are based on, you can see, a cryptographic protocol. There's no central authority, no central bank behind it. Currently, I believe one Bitcoin equals about $9 American, and they're traded, so there's virtual trading. So then I would have students engage, and what I wanted to show, I'm trying to show you authentic learning. I've given them an issue that is in the news, that is real, that is happening, to teach them the concept of currency. And then I would have them do a U-shaped discussion, where they have to decide anywhere from it's a great form of currency, we should definitely use this, to it's not even a currency, don't know why we're debating this, or somewhere in between. I've linked, and I won't show you them this evening, but I've linked to this a pro-Bitcoin, an anti-Bitcoin, and in the center I have, I believe it's a BBC or CNN, I forget, discussion with 3 different economists talking about the merits and drawbacks of bitcoins. And so as kids start to engage in their conversation after reading a little bit, we pause and we read some more material on it, and they rejoin the debate, we watch the clip. What I'm trying to show you is trying to draw in learning from a variety of sources. So I think when we talk about authentic learning, we want to think beyond what kids create. And so what I think about this, if we want kids in a media-saturated world, if you're going to use authentic learning, they need to be media literate. They need to know how to carefully examine information and think about its relevance. And notice I put here they need to be skeptical. That you need to question, when I read this in the news, does that fit with what I understand? Is it consistent with the evidence? Is it consistent with what others are saying? So I have to be media literate. I should be skeptical and when I consume information, which leads me to be selective. I can select relevant information. And then you draw on different sources. And I put a note here, not always customized for the learner. I think in the past, classrooms were dominated by materials that were produced by a publisher for a classroom environment. Today, kids are accessing all kinds of information, so they need to be careful about thinking about who created it, why they created it. We don't always have the filters in place. And can I look at the evidence through one or more disciplines? Now, I'm just going to back that up. When kids are creating authentic outputs, what's your purpose or audience? Okay, so what are you trying to communicate? Who's the audience you're communicating to? Because in an authentic learning, it's not just the teacher for it to be marked. We have other purposes. Oh, great. Yes, civics is wonderful for this. I'm going to show you some concrete things in just a moment. How do we apply the learning in real context, authentic context? Kids work with their personal strengths. And how do they use digital technologies? And I want to shift there just a little bit. Very quickly, authentic performance tasks, these are the outputs. Keep in mind this is just a term I made up by combining authentic assessment literature and performance-based learning literature. That when we talk about authentic, we're talking about tasks that simulate life beyond school, outside of school, and often have an audience beyond the teacher and the classmates. Who might our audience be for this product? And when I talk about performance tasks, how will students demonstrate understanding and competence through through a performance they do or a product, and how do we put those two together? So I'll just leave this up for you to read for a moment. I'm going to slide across so I can see. So as we move along, so authentic assessment, when we're talking authentic assessment, students are creating, performing, they're tapping into their ability to solve problems. Interesting, earlier, someone knows that the more we go up in education, the more we focus on the product, whereas the process is a very important part in authentic learning. Absolutely inquiry-based, okay, that we want to shift what success looks like in classrooms from accumulating isolated information to being able to use information to solve a problem within some kind of context, and that students can do this in a variety of ways. So you're absolutely right. Authentic assessment, which I've been working for a number of years, now we see things like differentiated learning and so on. They're just picking up in a similar area. Here's a list of just samples of things I'll just quickly touch on. And we need to broaden this. I have a social science background, so my apologies for the bias here. My last field trip before I left the classroom was actually to take my kids to the beach to build a sandcastle. I was teaching a grade 11 ancient history class. They were told the first week of September that a month from now they would be going to the beach to build a sandcastle. And that what they had to do was pick an ancient site that they think was an important showed something important about a civilization, and they had to be able to explain why they selected that as an important representation of their civilization. And a month later, we went to the beach in Toronto, just around the Humber Bump, on a nice sand stretch, and the kids had 4 hours to reproduce, in this case in sand, but they could also do it in snow in the winter, the most impressive reproduction they could of their ancient site. So by 2 o'clock, we had a huge stretch of beach covered with Epidaurus, the Greek temple, an Aztec pyramid, a Roman bath complex, the Great Sphinx, and so on. I want you to note I couldn't care less if kids are good sand sculptors. The whole point of this in the first unit of my course was for kids to be able to frame good inquiry questions, to gather credible and relevant sources of information, to develop a set of research notes that was complete and useful, and to be able to collaborate with others to pull this off, this piece off. I use it as my introduction to doing research and asking questions. My next unit, if you go down to move, they had to write a move review, building off the research that we were working on, their ability to frame questions and so on. They would then write a move review in the next unit, and we would build towards the historical essay. That's just one example. Creating a commemorative with the War of 1812 just passing, creating a life box, creating a board game, writing children's stories, putting characters on trial, creating picture books, let's just pause and see if you have any you could add to good, authentic tasks that have kids. What have you used in your class? Time capsule, wonderful. Let's see if we can get a few more of you just to add to this. What are some other interesting ways the kids could demonstrate their learning in more authentic, less traditional pen and paper? Dance your math, I'd love to see that. Create the journal, wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Getting kids to generate, make a proposal. Daphne, it's interesting to put geometry and patterns. Laura, my wife, we're working in math and critical thinking, has developed an entire cascading curriculum for the whole grade 3 year around students creating a quilt, and it integrates all of the math expectations as they build their quilt with illusions built in and so on. Yep, great, Carol. See it. Wonderful ideas. Now, I want to move. I'll give you her email. This is a planning guide I developed to help me think about planning an authentic assessment task. So at this point I'm in the task part where I think about the course, what course is, what's the grade level. Notice my small box here to think about my audience. That not only, because I think one of the most unfortunate things in education often is that kids spend a lot of time creating really interesting projects. They bring it in, it gets marked, and we send it home, and no one else really gets to see it. So I always want to think about, can I create an audience beyond my classroom? Because the kids who are already working on it, what if I use it for a parents' night display? What if could I invite another class to come in? Could my kids go somewhere else? I used to have my grade 11 ancient history class. They would have to create a display, but then put it up in one of the feeder schools. So now the new grade 4 curriculum, you have to create a display that's age appropriate for grade 4s on an early society. What would you put on it, and so on. So notice what I'm trying to do is say, instead of putting up a display in our class for us to see, who are already learning this, what if we had to take this to another audience? What are the big ideas, and often based on those overall expectations? What are my assessment targets, typically framed using the achievement chart? What are the key understandings I want kids to develop? How do I want them to think and communicate? And those will feed into saying, well, this will be my assessment task. You'll notice my subtasks. So they are, if I want you to do a movie review, then the first thing you'll need to do is to be able to, frame good questions about the movie you're going to watch and gather research that would help you dig in.